There's a tiny symbol hiding in almost every app you use. It sits quietly in the corner of your screen, and with one click, it protects hours of work from disappearing. Most people recognize it instantly, even if they've never seen the real object in their hands. It's small, square, and topped with a little metal shutter. An artifact from a time when saving your work felt far more fragile than it does today. So why is the floppy disk still the symbol for save, even though the technology itself has basically vanished? How did an outdated storage device become one of the most permanent icons in modern software design? Let's take a closer look at how that happened, right here, on History of Simple Things. The floppy disk was introduced by IBM in 1971 as an 8-inch magnetic storage disk designed to load microcode into large computer systems. It was flexible, literally floppy, and encased in a thin protective sleeve. Over time, it evolved into smaller formats, the 5.25-inch disk in the late 1970s and the more durable 3.5-inch disk in the early 1980s, developed by Sony. The 3.5-inch version, with its rigid plastic shell and sliding metal shutter, is the one most people recognize today. By the 1980s and 1990s, floppy disks had become the standard way to store and transfer files between personal computers. In early personal computing, saving was not optional or automatic. Programs did not constantly sync your work to remote servers. If your computer crashed or lost power, unsaved work was gone. Operating systems like MS-DOS required users to manually manage files, often through typed commands. Even later graphical systems such as Windows 3.1 relied heavily on users remembering to click Save. The floppy disk was the primary destination for that action. Hard drives existed, but they were smaller, more expensive, and not always standard in early PCs. For many users, saving literally meant writing data onto a floppy disk. As graphical user interfaces became more common in the 1980s, software designers needed simple visual symbols to represent actions like opening, printing, and saving. In 1983, Apple's Lisa computer and later the Macintosh popularized clickable icons. The save function was naturally represented by the most common storage medium of the time, the 3.5-inch floppy disk. Applications such as Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel used a tiny floppy disk graphic to indicate saving. Because the floppy disk was already strongly associated with preserving data, the visual connection was immediate and intuitive for users. By the late 1990s, floppy disks were becoming obsolete. A standard 3.5-inch disk stored 1.44 megabytes of data, which quickly became insufficient as files grew larger. CDs, USB flash drives, and eventually cloud storage replaced them. In 1998, Apple Inc. made a controversial decision to remove the floppy disk drive from the original iMac G3, signaling a broader industry shift away from the format. Over the next decade, most manufacturers followed suit. Yet even as the physical drives disappeared from computers, the floppy disk icon remained in software interfaces. The reason the floppy disk icon endured has less to do with technology and more to do with design psychology. Once a symbol becomes widely recognized, changing it can create confusion. By the time floppy disks vanish from everyday use, the icon had already been standardized across operating systems and applications. Replacing it with a new symbol, like a cloud or a hard drive, would have required retraining millions of users. In design, familiarity reduces cognitive effort. The floppy disk had become a stable visual shorthand for preserve this. Even users who never owned a floppy disk learned the meaning of the symbol through repetition, not experience. The floppy disk icon is an example of what designers call a skeuomorph, a digital element that imitates a physical object, even after the original object is obsolete. Early smartphone apps used images of notepads, cameras, and bookshelves to make digital tools feel familiar. Over time, many of those designs became flatter and more abstract. Yet the save icon remains surprisingly consistent. Part of the reason is that saving itself is an abstract concept. There is no obvious modern physical object that represents the act. A cloud might suggest syncing, but not necessarily permanence. The floppy disk, despite being outdated, clearly communicates the idea of storing something securely for later. Today, many people recognize the floppy disk icon without ever having used a real floppy disk. For them, it doesn't represent a storage device from the 1980s or 1990s. It simply means save. That shift shows how meaning can detach from the original object and take on a life of its own. The floppy disk was once essential for storing school papers, office files, and software, but its small capacity and physical limits eventually made it obsolete. Even so, the symbol endured because it had already built a powerful association with preserving work. In modern apps filled with cloud syncing and auto-save features, that small square icon remains one of the clearest visual reminders that your work is being safely stored for later. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of simple things. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.